Wananchi viva! Tumekataa! Wananchi power! Wananchi viva, msiogope! Tumechoka! Hata hao askari ambao wananishika na kugania watoto wao.
What? From protesters going blind from rubber bullets fired at them to peaceful protesters being gunned down. Kenya has become a battleground no one expected it to become at the start of this week's peaceful protests. The reason? Kenya's leaders have gone mad. At least that's what the majority of the citizens in the country believe, and that's what we will be exploring in today's episode. Welcome back to the Bizarre Society, and today our country of focus is Kenya. Without wasting much time, let's jump right into it. To truly understand what's happening in Kenya right now, we need to go back a bit. Kenya has a rich history marked by periods of colonial rule, independence struggles, and efforts to build a stable nation. Since gaining independence from Britain in 1963, Kenya has experienced significant changes. However, corruption, economic disparity, and political oppression have been long-standing issues that many Kenyans face. The spark for the current uprising came in early 2024. The government, led by President William Ruto, announced a series of austerity measures. These were supposed to help reduce the national debt but ended up hurting many people. These measures included severe cuts to public services, increased taxes, and higher costs for basic necessities like food and fuel. In January 2024, the government's announcement of these austerity measures caused widespread discontent. Public sector workers, like teachers and healthcare workers, faced salary cuts and reduced benefits. By February 2024, protests began popping up in various parts of the country, starting small but quickly gaining momentum. By March 2024, opposition leaders, including prominent figures like Raila Odinga and activists from civil society groups, began organizing larger rallies. The government's attempts to downplay the unrest failed, and the protests spread to major cities. In April 2024, the cost of living continued to rise, with prices of basic goods like maize flour, sugar, and cooking oil increasing significantly. This fueled public anger, and more people joined the protests. In May 2024, the government introduced further tax hikes, particularly affecting the middle and lower income groups. This was seen as the final straw for many Kenyans who were already struggling. On June 3, 2024, a massive protest was organized in Nairobi, with tens of thousands of people taking to the streets. The protest began peacefully but soon turned violent as police used tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowd. Clashes between protesters and police resulted in several injuries and arrests. By June 5, 2024, protests had spread to other major cities like Mombasa, Kisumu, and Eldoret. The intensity of the protests escalated, with more people joining in to express their frustration over the economic situation and government policies. As with any large-scale uprising, there have been unfortunate casualties. During the first week of the protests, dozens of people were injured, and at least 10 were killed in clashes with police. The use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition by the police has been widely criticized. On June 10, 2024, Human Rights Watch reported that over 50 people had been killed since the protest began, with hundreds more injured. Many of the injuries were severe, including cases of people losing their eyesight due to rubber bullets. By June 15, 2024, the number of casualties continued to rise, with over 100 deaths reported. Thousands of protesters, including activists, students, and journalists, have been detained. There are also reports of poor treatment and overcrowded conditions in detention facilities. On June 20, 2024, the Kenyan Red Cross confirmed that they had treated over 1,500 people for injuries related to the protests, including many with gunshot wounds. They also reported a shortage of medical supplies due to the overwhelming number of casualties. The impact of these casualties extends beyond the individuals directly involved. Families have lost loved ones, and communities have been torn apart by the violence. The economic disruption caused by the protests has also hit many families hard, as businesses have been forced to close and workers have lost their jobs. Now let's talk about how the government has responded to this uprising. Spoiler alert, it hasn't been great. The government's initial reaction was to try and suppress the protests. They deployed a heavy police presence in major cities, and the use of force against protesters was widely criticized. The president made a public statement condemning the protests, calling them unlawful and blaming them for causing instability in the country. The police were heavily armed and ready to crack down on any signs of dissent. They used tear gas to disperse the crowds, which caused chaos and panic among the protesters. This was just the beginning. When tear gas wasn't enough to break up the gatherings, the police resorted to using rubber bullets. These rubber bullets are meant to be non-lethal, but they can still cause serious injuries. Many protesters were hit in the eyes, losing their eyesight, while others suffered broken bones and deep bruises. But it didn't stop there. In some instances, the police used live ammunition against the protesters. This extreme measure has resulted in several deaths and many more severe injuries. The sight of armed police firing into crowds of unarmed civilians shocked the nation and the world. Videos and images of these violent crackdowns spread quickly on social media, fueling further outrage and drawing international condemnation. The heavy-handed response didn't just involve physical force. The government also tried to control the narrative by cracking down on the media. Several news outlets that were covering the protests were shut down, and journalists were harassed, detained, and even beaten. Social media platforms were restricted, making it difficult for protesters to organize and communicate. This digital blackout was an attempt to silence the voices of the people and control the flow of information. Facing increasing pressure from both domestic and international communities, the government has made some attempts at dialogue. They have promised to review the austerity measures and have called for talks with opposition leaders and protest organizers. However, these promises have been met with skepticism, as many feel that they are simply a way to buy time and diffuse the immediate tension. Another troubling aspect of the government's response has been the crackdown on the media. Several news outlets have been shut down, and journalists covering the protests have been harassed and detained. Social media platforms have also been restricted, making it difficult for protesters to communicate and organize. The international community has been watching the situation in Kenya closely. Several countries and human rights organizations have condemned the government's heavy-handed response and called for an end to the violence. There have also been calls for an independent investigation into the deaths and injuries caused by the protests. So, where does this leave us? The situation in Kenya is still very fluid, and it's hard to predict what will happen next. What's clear is that the people of Kenya are demanding change, and they're willing to fight for it. Whether the government will listen and make the necessary changes remains to be seen. If the government genuinely engages in dialogue and addresses the protesters' demands, there is hope for a peaceful resolution. However, if the repression continues, the country could face prolonged unrest and instability. The upcoming elections, scheduled for late 2024, will be a crucial moment, potentially serving as a turning point for the nation's future. Before we wrap up, here are some ways you can stay informed and support the cause. Follow reputable news sources for updates, engage with social media campaigns to raise awareness, and support organizations that are working on the ground in Kenya to provide aid and advocate for human rights. And with that, we conclude today's video. Please subscribe and share. It helps us out a ton and makes it possible for us to keep making videos like this for you. Until the next one, stay safe and see you soon.